In the scorching heat of the Persian plateau, where the sun blazed like molten copper across endless horizons, 10,000 men moved as one entity through the dust clouds of eternity. They were not merely soldiers, they were the Athenatoi, the Immortals, a force so perfectly engineered that death itself seemed to bow before their disciplined ranks. The year was 550 BCE, and the world trembled at the sound of their synchronized footsteps. Each boot struck the earth with mathematical precision, creating a rhythm that echoed across the vast Persian Empire like the heartbeat of a god. Their spears, exactly 7 feet in length, caught the dying light of dusk and transformed it into a forest of gleaming death that stretched beyond the horizon. Cyrus the Great stood atop his golden chariot, watching his ultimate creation march past with the satisfaction of a craftsman who had achieved perfection. The Immortals were more than warriors. They were the physical manifestation of Persian imperial ideology, a living symbol that the empire was eternal, unchanging, and divinely ordained. Their name was not mere boastfulness. It was a strategic, psychological weapon that had conquered minds before their spears conquered bodies. The genius of the Immortals lay not in their individual prowess, but in their systematic approach to warfare. When a warrior fell in battle, another stepped forward to take his place before the dust settled on his predecessor's corpse. The unit maintained exactly 10,000 men at all times, never more, never less. This mathematical precision in the chaos of combat created a psychological terror that no enemy had ever successfully countered. Each Immortal wore a scale armor that shimmered like fish scales in moonlight, crafted from the finest bronze and iron that Persian metallurgy could produce. Their shields bore the sacred symbol of Ahura Mazda, the winged sun disk that reminded all who saw it that these men fought under divine protection. But it was their faces that truly intimidated enemies, expressionless masks of discipline that suggested men who had transcended human emotion and become instruments of imperial will. The recruitment process was as rigorous as it was exclusive. Future Immortals were selected from the noble families of Persia, Media, and Elam, beginning their training in childhood. They learned not just the arts of war, but the Zoroastrian philosophy that gave meaning to their existence. They were taught that death in service to the King of Kings was not an ending, but a transformation, a passage to true immortality in the eternal struggle between light and darkness. Their training grounds in Persepolis were marvels of military engineering, obstacle courses that would challenge Olympic athletes, combat scenarios that tested every possible battlefield situation, and endurance trials that pushed human limits. But the most important aspect of their training was psychological, the systematic erosion of individual identity in favor of collective consciousness. An Immortal did not fight for personal glory, but as a cell in the body of the empire. The organizational structure reflected the hierarchical nature of Persian society. 10 companies of 1,000 men each, commanded by Hazarapatis, who answered directly to the King of Kings. This chain of command allowed for instantaneous coordination across the entire unit, creating a military machine that could execute complex maneuvers with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. Their equipment was both functional and symbolic. The golden pomegranates that adorned the butts of their spears were not mere decoration. They represented fertility and abundance, the promise that Persian rule brought prosperity to conquered peoples. Their flowing robes, dyed in royal purple and gold, announced their status as extensions of royal authority. Every piece of their gear was designed to project power and inspire submission. The Immortals served multiple functions within the Persian system. In peacetime, they were the ceremonial guard of Persepolis, standing motionless as statues while foreign ambassadors passed between their ranks. This ritual humiliation was as effective as any military victory, demonstrating that even the mightiest foreign kings were insignificant before Persian power. In war, they were the spearhead of imperial expansion, the force that turned conquest from possibility to inevitability. Under Darius I, the Immortals reached their zenith. The great king understood that controlling an empire stretching from India to Egypt required more than military might. It demanded the perception of omnipresence. The Immortals became the visible manifestation of this power, their presence at every significant ceremony and their participation in every major campaign, creating the illusion that Persian authority was truly eternal. Their discipline was legendary throughout the ancient world. They could march for days without showing fatigue, maintain perfect formations under arrow storms, and execute complex battlefield maneuvers as if they shared a single mind. This synchronization was not accidental, but the result of years of training where individual will was subordinated to collective purpose. They moved like a single organism, thought like a single mind, and fought like a single weapon. The psychological impact of the Immortals extended far beyond the battlefield. Their very existence challenged the fundamental assumptions of ancient warfare. Other armies grew tired, suffered casualties, and eventually needed rest and reinforcement. The Immortals appeared to be exempt from these human limitations, creating a sense of hopelessness in their enemies that often led to surrender without battle. As the 5th century BCE approached, the Immortals had proven their effectiveness in dozens of campaigns. They had conquered Lydia, captured Babylon, and extended Persian borders to limits that seemed impossible. But their greatest test lay ahead, in lands where men valued something called freedom more than life itself, where the very concept of divine kingship was challenged by the radical notion that humans could govern themselves. The whispers of a Western expedition began to circulate through the barracks of Persepolis. The Immortals sharpened their spears with renewed dedication, polished their armor until it gleamed like mirrors, and prepared their minds for a campaign that would define not just their legend, but the future of civilization itself. Want to see how these legendary warriors faced their greatest challenge? Subscribe to follow their journey into the unknown. Hit that like button if you're enjoying this historical epic, and comment below. What aspect of the Immortals' training and organization impresses you most? The dawn of 490 BCE painted the Aegean Sea in shades of bronze and gold, but beneath its serene surface, the currents of history were about to change forever. On the beaches of Marathon, 10,000 Persian Immortals prepared to face an enemy unlike any they had encountered. Greek hoplites who fought not for empire or king, but for a revolutionary concept that would reshape the ancient world: freedom. The Persian fleet had crossed the wine-dark sea like a floating city, its 1,000 ships carrying not just soldiers, but the weight of imperial destiny. Darius I had declared that the Greeks must be punished for their audacity in supporting the Ionian rebellion, and more importantly, for their refusal to acknowledge Persian supremacy. The Immortals, accustomed to enemies who surrendered at the sight of their golden shields, were about to discover that some things could not be conquered through intimidation alone. As the sun climbed higher, the Immortals deployed in their traditional formation on the plain of Marathon. 10,000 warriors arranged in perfect geometric precision, their spears creating a metal forest that caught the morning light and threw it back in blinding flashes. Their shields, emblazoned with the winged sun disk of Ahura Mazda, formed a golden wall that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon. The psychological impact was immediate and intentional. No mortal army could stand against such perfection. But across the battlefield, something unprecedented was taking shape. Fewer than 11,000 Greeks had assembled under the command of Miltiades, but they possessed something the Immortals had never encountered: the desperate courage of free men defending their homeland. The Athenian hoplites, with their bronze helmets and long spears, formed a line that seemed fragile compared to the Persian war machine. Yet in their eyes burned a fire that even the most disciplined Immortal could not help but notice. The battle began, with the war cry that had echoed across a dozen conquered lands. Ahura Mazda thundered from 10,000 throats as the Immortals advanced in their measured cadence. Each step was calculated, each movement synchronized, each breath taken in unison. They moved like a single organism, their spears lowering in perfect alignment, their shields overlapping to create an impenetrable barrier of bronze and steel. The ground trembled beneath their feet as they approached the Greek line. The dust they raised created a cloud that dimmed the sun, and the rhythmic sound of their advance was like the beating of some enormous heart. This was the moment they had trained for, the culmination of decades of preparation. They were the pinnacle of military evolution, the ultimate expression of disciplined warfare. But the Greeks did not break. Instead, they did something that defied every precedent in the Persian military manual. They charged. The Athenian phalanx, with shields interlocked and spears extended, transformed into a bronze-tipped battering ram that crashed into the Persian center with the force of an avalanche. The impact was thunderous, a collision of metal against metal that could be heard for miles. For the first time in their storied history, the Immortals experienced genuine resistance. The Greeks not only refused to flee, but pushed forward with a ferocity born of desperation and love of liberty. Each hoplite who fell was immediately replaced by another, creating a distorted mirror image of the Persian replacement system. The battle became a grinding, brutal affair that tested not just military skill, but the very philosophy that underpinned each army. Miltiades had studied Persian tactics with obsessive attention to detail. He understood that the Immortals' strength lay in their ability to maintain perfect formations and their psychological impact on enemy morale. But he had also identified a crucial weakness: their dependence on systematic order. If that order could be disrupted, if chaos could be introduced into their ranks, the Immortals would become merely mortal soldiers in foreign armor. The Greek strategy unfolded with surgical precision. While the center of the phalanx held the Persian advance, the Athenian wings executed a pincer movement that enveloped the Immortals from both sides. For the first time, the eternal warriors found themselves surrounded, attacked from multiple directions, unable to maintain the formation that was their greatest strength. The moment of truth came when the Immortals, pressed from all sides, began to retreat toward their ships. It was not an organized withdrawal, but something they had never experienced before: a rout. The warriors who had conquered half the known world found themselves running toward the beach, pursued by Greek hoplites, shouting in a language they did not understand, but whose message was universal. Freedom had prevailed over tyranny. The retreat to the ships was chaotic and brutal. Immortals, trained to advance always forward, found themselves in uncharted emotional and tactical territory. Their spears, now useless in close combat, were abandoned in the sand. Their golden shields, symbols of invincibility, lay scattered across the beach like broken promises. The Persian naval commanders watched in horror as their elite troops stumbled into the surf, many drowning in their heavy armor as they desperately tried to reach the safety of the ships. When the Persian fleet finally pulled away from the Greek shore, it carried more than defeated soldiers. It carried the first crack in the image of invincibility that had sustained the Persian Empire for decades. The Immortals had learned that there were forces in the world that could not be conquered through discipline and numbers alone. Forces that drew their strength from something deeper than imperial decree. The news of Marathon spread through the Persian Empire like wildfire. Subjects who had accepted Persian rule as inevitable began to whisper that perhaps the gods were not always on the side of the King of Kings. The Immortals, for the first time in their history, returned home not as conquerors, but as soldiers who had tasted the bitter flavor of defeat. In the aftermath of Marathon, the Immortals faced a crisis of identity. Their entire existence had been built on the assumption of inevitable victory, on the belief that they were the physical manifestation of divine will. The defeat forced them to confront the possibility that they were, after all, merely human, subject to the same limitations and vulnerabilities as any other army. The Persian court buzzed with recriminations and demands for revenge. Darius I, his pride wounded beyond measure, began planning a second expedition that would dwarf the first. The Immortals, their reputation tarnished but their discipline intact, threw themselves into preparation with an intensity that bordered on desperation. They knew that their next encounter with the Greeks would determine not just the fate of the empire, but the meaning of their own existence. As the years passed and preparations for the second invasion intensified, the Immortals underwent a transformation. They were no longer the confident avatars of imperial destiny, but warriors who had learned that even gods could bleed. This knowledge would both strengthen and weaken them in the trials that lay ahead. The unthinkable had happened. The Immortals had been defeated, but their story was far from over. Subscribe to see how they sought redemption in the most epic battle of the ancient world. Smash that like button if you're hooked on this historical saga, and tell us in the comments, what do you think motivated the Greeks to fight so fiercely against impossible odds? 10 years after Marathon, the flames of vengeance burned in every Persian heart, from the Indus to the Aegean. Xerxes, son of Darius, had transformed his father's defeat into a personal obsession that consumed the resources of half the known world. The year 480 BCE would witness the most colossal collision between East and West in ancient history, where immortality would face mortality in a narrow mountain pass that would echo through eternity. The preparation for the second Greek invasion was beyond monumental. It was mythic. The Immortals, now under the command of Hydarnes, had spent a decade perfecting new tactics and purging the memory of Marathon from their collective consciousness. Their training had intensified to levels that bordered on the inhuman, because they knew they faced an enemy who had achieved the impossible, defeating Persian arms through sheer force of will. When Xerxes' army crossed the Hellespont on his bridge of boats, the sight defied human comprehension. More than 1 million men, according to ancient sources, followed the banners of the King of Kings. The procession took 7 days and 7 nights to cross, a river of humanity that flowed from Asia into Europe like a tide of destiny. At the vanguard marched the Immortals, their golden shields catching the morning sun and reflecting it back in brilliant flashes that could be seen for miles. The scale of the Persian expedition was a deliberate statement of power. Xerxes had assembled not just an army, but a demonstration of what happened when the Persian Empire focused its full attention on a problem. Representatives from every corner of the known world marched in his ranks: Scythian horse archers from the steppes, Egyptian infantry with their curved swords, Indian war elephants that trumpeted like thunder, and Phoenician marines who commanded the seas. But at the heart of this massive organism, the Immortals remained the beating heart of Persian military power. They had learned from Marathon, adapted their tactics, and reinforced their psychological conditioning. Their spears had been lengthened, their armor redesigned, and their discipline elevated to levels that seemed to transcend human limitations. They moved through the Greek countryside like a force of nature, leaving behind a trail of surrendered cities and terrified populations. The Greeks, however, had also learned from Marathon. Under Spartan leadership, they had developed a strategy that would use Greece's mountainous terrain as a force multiplier. Every pass, every valley, every narrow defile would become a choke point where superior numbers became a liability rather than an advantage. And at the center of this strategy lay a place whose name would become synonymous with heroic sacrifice: Thermopylae. The hot gates of Thermopylae were a natural bottleneck, where the largest army in human history could be held by a relative handful of determined defenders. When the Immortals arrived at this desolate mountain pass, they encountered a sight that challenged every assumption about warfare. 300 Spartans, supported by a few thousand Greek allies, standing in the narrow gap as if they could stop the ocean itself. Leonidas, the Spartan king, had understood something fundamental about the nature of power and resistance. Numbers meant nothing if they could not be effectively deployed. Discipline was useless if it could not adapt to changing circumstances, and immortality was meaningless if it was not willing to pay the ultimate price for its beliefs. The Spartans had come to Thermopylae knowing they would die, but also knowing that their death would have meaning beyond their individual lives. The first clash between the Immortals and the Spartans was a collision between two diametrically opposed philosophies of warfare. The Persians fought for the glory of empire and the will of their divine king. The Greeks fought for the radical notion that men could govern themselves, and that freedom was worth any sacrifice. When these two forces met in the narrow pass, the ancient world held its breath. The Immortals advanced in their traditional formation, but the narrow confines of the pass neutralized their numerical advantage. Their spears, designed for open combat, found themselves matched against Spartan weapons and tactics that had been perfected over centuries of constant warfare. The bronze-armored Spartans, fighting on familiar ground and for familiar values, met the Persian assault with a ferocity that seemed to transcend human limitations. For 3 days, the Immortals hurled themselves against the Spartan shield wall without gaining a single foot of ground. Each assault was repelled with brutal efficiency, each charge broken against the bronze and iron determination of men who had been raised from birth to view death in battle as the highest honor. The pass became a charnel house, where the flower of Persian nobility learned that courage could not be purchased with gold or commanded by royal decree. The psychological impact on the Immortals was devastating. Accustomed to quick victories and terrified enemies, they found themselves locked in a grinding battle of attrition that tested not just their physical endurance, but their fundamental beliefs about their own invincibility. For the first time, they began to understand that immortality was not just a matter of replacement, but of unbreakable will. The tactical genius of the Spartans lay not just in their individual prowess, but in their ability to fight as a unified organism. Their shields overlapped to create an impenetrable barrier, their spears thrust in perfect coordination, and their discipline never wavered despite the overwhelming odds. They had transformed the narrow pass into a killing ground, where Persian numerical superiority became a liability. The betrayal of Ephialtes changed everything. The exiled Greek showed the Persians a mountain path that allowed them to circumvent the pass and attack the Spartans from behind. When Leonidas realized he was being flanked, he made a decision that would define the concept of heroism for millennia. He would stay and fight to the end, transforming military defeat into moral victory. The final battle was apocalyptic in its intensity. The Immortals, freed from the constraints of the narrow pass, surrounded the surviving Spartans on the small hill where they made their last stand. But even in this moment of apparent triumph, something fundamental had changed. The Persian warriors, who had begun the campaign as symbols of invincibility, now fought against men who had demonstrated that death could be a form of victory. When the last Spartan fell, the Immortals stood victorious but transformed. They had won the battle, but at a cost that went far beyond casualties. The system of instant replacement that had defined their identity had broken down under the intensity of the fighting. For the first time in their history, gaps appeared in their ranks that could not be immediately filled. The continuation of the Greek campaign brought the Immortals to Salamis, where the Persian fleet was shattered by Greek naval tactics. The defeat at sea meant that Xerxes' army was isolated in hostile territory, dependent on supply lines that stretched across thousands of miles. The aura of invincibility that had sustained the Persian war machine was crumbling piece by piece. At Plataea, a year later, the Immortals fought their final major battle on Greek soil. Facing a Greek coalition that had learned to fight without fear, the Persian warriors found themselves outmaneuvered and outfought by enemies who had absorbed the lessons of Marathon and Thermopylae. The defeat was total, marking the end of Xerxes' dream of European conquest. The return to Persia was a study in melancholy. The Immortals, reduced in number and broken in spirit, marched along the same roads they had traveled as conquerors. The cities that had once celebrated their passage now watched in silence, understanding that something fundamental had changed in the order of the world. The age of unquestioned Persian supremacy was ending. The Immortals continued to exist for centuries after their Greek defeats, but they never recovered the aura of invincibility that had made them legendary. They remained elite soldiers, but they were no longer the carriers of immortality. They had learned that even gods could be challenged, and that freedom was a force capable of defeating destiny itself. The fall of the Immortals marked the beginning of the end for the Persian Empire as the dominant force in the ancient world. When Alexander the Great arrived 2 centuries later, he found an empire that had lost its spiritual invincibility. The heirs of the Immortals fought bravely, but no longer with the certainty that they represented the eternal order of the universe. In the end, the Immortals discovered that true immortality lay not in the endless replacement of fallen warriors, but in the ideas and principles for which those warriors died. The Greeks they had fought and failed to conquer had achieved something far more lasting than military victory. They had proven that the human spirit, when fighting for freedom and justice, could overcome any earthly power. The legacy of the Immortals serves as a reminder that no empire, no matter how powerful, can survive the erosion of its founding principles. They had been created to embody the eternal nature of Persian power, but they had learned that the only eternal force in human history is the desire for freedom, a lesson that resonates across the centuries to our own time. Thus ended the legend of the Immortals, warriors who challenged death but could not defeat the human spirit. Subscribe for more epic historical content, hit that like button if you've enjoyed this journey through ancient warfare, and comment below. What other legendary military units from history would you like us to explore? Remember, no power is truly eternal, but the lessons of courage and freedom echo through the ages.